Is this being turned over to me?
Yes, thank you so much,
Okay.
Michael.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Itzkowitz. I'm the president and founder of the HEA Group, which is an acronym for the Higher Education Advisory Group. Just to give you some background about me, I'm from Florida. Save your jokes for later. And I was in DC about 10 years ago or so, and I worked at the US Department of Education from 2010 to 2016. And in the last couple of years, I started to work on post-secondary education. And my last role there was actually the director of the US Department of Education's College Scorecard, which is the largest database of higher education data that was made available by the department starting in 2013, and they actually started to make earnings data available in 2015. So since then, I've left and started to have my fun, not just managing this project, but actually looking through the data, the troves of data that are made available. Just to give you a sense, there's about over 6,000 institutions in the data set itself. And there's about 2,000 individual pieces of information, individual variables on each specific institution. So after I left, I started to look at all different ways to figure out how well we're actually serving our students in higher ed and what the data can and can't tell us. So just earlier this year, because I work in federal policy mostly, I decided to take another look at earnings data. And specifically, I was interested in thinking about federal policy precedents that have been used in the past to see if the majority of students are earning above that amount at institutions across the United States. So if we want to go to the next slide. And as mentioned, this was luckily, unfortunately, also gained interest from national news outlets, including the New York Times. So it's definitely a privilege and always cool to see your work mentioned, wherever it may be, especially in one of the leading newspapers and most circulated newspapers across the United States. So as mentioned, I looked at a database that in the College Scorecard, and essentially this covered 3,887 institutions across the United States. And that it covered about 5 million students that were available in this data. I said that I do look at federal policy, so I looked at things that had federal policy precedent, because in federal policy, it's easier for lawmakers to sort of latch on to something that they already know exists, and it gives it more of a concrete measure rather than a measure that's arbitrary and capricious if they chose to draw a line in terms of college accountability. And that's something that I'm personally very interested in. So I looked at the outcomes in 4 different ways for this specific paper. The first one was I looked at whether the majority of students at an institution earn more than the federal poverty line, which is about $14,580 in 2023. Now, I think that we can all agree that this is an extremely low standard, and everyone who basically is employed in whether or not they graduated college should definitely earn more than this amount. And perhaps maybe there shouldn't be any colleges that receive federal financial aid to where the majority of students are earning less than this amount. The next one that has federal policy precedent is 150% of the federal poverty line, which is about $22,000. This is used in different things, such as, I think, Medicare or Medicaid benefits as one of them, including it also is used in things to calculate your student loan. We look at discretionary income that people earn above 150% of the federal poverty line. I also looked at the minimum wage, and I decided to pick a $15 minimum wage for this specific paper, as there are a number of states that are kind of bumping up to that number. I understand that the federal minimum wage is still at $7.25, as it has been for quite a while. But for this specific paper, I decided to look at institutions and whether they're allowing the majority of students to earn more than $15 minimum wage, which I calculated to be about $30,000 per year. Then I looked at the earnings of a typical high school graduate nationally, which is measured by the US Department of Education to be about $32,000 a year. And the way that they get this is from the American Community Survey, which is administered by the Census Bureau. So if we want to go to the next slide. Thank you. So as we mentioned, the first go around on this was, are students earning more than the federal poverty line? And I would say Yes, at majority of institutions, they are as they should be. We can see the vast majority of institutions that are allowing students to earn at least $10,000 more than this very minimal economic benchmark. But we can still see on the left-hand side of the screen, believe it or not, there are 18 federally funded colleges that leave the majority of students earning less than this amount. So the next thing that we looked at was, are students earning more than 150% of the federal poverty line, which I mentioned was around $22,000 a year. Still, the answer is yes. Majority of colleges allow their students to earn more than this very minimal economic benchmark. However, we can see that the number bumps up. We can see that there's actually 305 institutions of higher education that show the majority of students earning less than this. That's about 8% of all institutions within our sample. The next thing we looked at was the $15 minimum wage, which is about $30,000 a year. Here you can see the numbers start to get a little more worrisome. Even though this is just asking the question, are students earning just above this minimal economic benchmark of $15 an hour? We can see here that about 22% of institutions, or 852 of them, actually show the majority of students earning less than that amount. And the last thing that we looked at here, which raised the most eyebrows, was, are students earning more than the typical high school graduate? Essentially, when people are talking about this specific topic, they're kind of saying, does college offer some sort of economic premium? Are you earning more than someone who has a high school diploma but no college experience whatsoever? And again, I would say, yes, the majority of colleges do deliver on this promise. They are showing students earning more than the typical high school graduate, but we actually notice over 1,000 institutions across the United States that show the majority of students earning less than this amount every single year. Now, I think a question that's going to come up is, Michael, who the heck are these institutions that you're talking about? Now, I would say that the majority of them are disproportionately located in the for-profit sector, specifically institutions that offer shorter-term certificate programs. But that's not always the case. We do notice some other institutions, including public and private nonprofit institutions, albeit not as many, but I think about 9 and 14% respectively, that also show the majority of their students earning less than the typical high school graduate. This is even 10 years after they've entered the institution. That's where I'm measuring these earnings from. It's 10 years after students have entered that specific institution of higher education. So I'm going to talk about just a few more ways that we can think about measuring whether or not colleges include some sort of return on investment. And I see some really awesome questions coming in, but I'm not going to answer them right now. But I just say, please keep putting them in the chat. So this way we can address them right after we're done and make sure that we cover everything that folks want to cover. So in April 2020, I tried to create something and I called it the price to earnings premium. And essentially, I was thinking, how can we measure the return on investment that students are getting at institutions across the United States? And just as stock analysts can kind of recognize the price to earnings ratio of a specific stock, why can't students and families have some sort of similar metric, at least as a starting point, when thinking about making one of the largest financial decisions of their lives behind obtaining a mortgage? Now, this is important for a number of different reasons. Whether we like it or not, the number one reason why students are attending college today is for greater employability and to have a financially secure future. From a taxpayer's perspective, I would say this is also extremely important. Obviously, there's a lot of state taxes that go into state investments when it comes to higher ed, but since I work at the federal level, I can see that there's $110 billion annually that goes to institutions of higher education just in the form of student grants and student loans. We've also noticed that the cost of college has continued to increase, even exponentially, across the past few decades. Sometimes we'll hear this story, or at least I will, from lawmakers that, I remember when college used to cost 50 cents a semester. And I'm like, thank you very much, Elizabeth Warren. But yes, the price has gone up significantly and it costs a lot more nowadays. And we've also seen the national debt raise to about 1.7 trillion, which has probably gone up since I've said that number. So I think that we're approaching nearly $2 trillion in outstanding student debt nowadays. The last thing I'll mention is that I think that this has raised in the consciousness of college consumers over the past few years following the pandemic. As we may recall, a lot of us or family members or people we know were actually forced to work from home remotely doing their college classes. And the anecdote is people were taking college classes from their parents' basement, yet they were paying the same amount for those classes. So a lot of people started to raise the question of, is college worth it? What am I actually getting for my tuition dollars? Am I getting a bang for my educational buck? So basically, the price to earnings premium that I suggested as one way to measure the ROI of institutions across the United States measures the time it takes students to recoup their educational costs based off of the earnings premium that they obtain at a specific institution. Now, the way that I look at costs is something that you all are probably familiar with. I look at something specifically called net cost. So this isn't the sticker price, which are usually a lot higher before any sort of discounts or scholarships are given. I decided to look at the average annual net cost at institutions, which is the cost that students actually pay out of pocket after all grants and scholarships are awarded. Now, they can pay this through personal finances, or they can also take on student debt to help pay this. But this is the price that they're paying out of pocket. For a four-year institution, I just took that average number that's sent to the U.S. Department of Education by institutions themselves, and I times that number by 4 years. I gave institutions the benefit of the doubt, and I said, these students will finish in 4 years. Let's calculate the net cost at 4 years for a four-year institution, at 2 years for a two-year institution, and at 1 year for an institution that primarily grants certificates as their main credential. Now, the next part of this is the earnings premium. And what do I mean by earnings premium? Well, it's something that we addressed earlier, and it answers the question of, are students earning more than a typical high school graduate with no college experience whatsoever? So through the Census Bureau data, we're actually able to see how much high school graduates are making in each state across the United States. And I'm able to look at the colleges within each state and see their median earnings, which I'll look at 10 years after they've enrolled in an institution for most of my studies. And I'll say, are students earning more? How much more are they earning? If they're earning $10,000 more than the average high school student, that's their earnings premium. They're earning $10,000 additional dollars a year by entering an institution of higher education. And on the next slide, I'm just going to show you some practical examples of how this might play itself. So we took a couple of institutions here that you may be familiar with. We looked at the University of Illinois, Chicago. We looked at Loyola, and I decided to look at a primarily online institution located in Virginia, which you all are probably familiar with, called Liberty University. So at University of Illinois, Chicago, we can see that I believe it costs about $13,000 a year, which if you multiply that by 4 years, it equals somewhere around $54,248. That's how much it's going to cost the average student to obtain a 4-year degree in 4 years. However, I can see that their students are actually making around $29,480 more than the typical high school graduate in Chicago, right? So there's a pretty big earnings premium by those students who attended University of Illinois, Chicago. They can then use that $29,480 to recoup that $54,248 in just 1.8 years' time. So I hope that makes sense to everyone. Now, just looking at Liberty, we can see that it costs a lot more. This is a much more expensive educational experience, post-secondary education experience. It costs students around $25,000 out of pocket each and every year to attend Liberty University, around $101,000 for a 4-year degree. We could see that those students are actually making less than students who attend University of Illinois, Chicago. They're only making around $11,700 each and every year, more than the typical high school graduate in Virginia. Therefore, it takes a lot longer. They can use that $11,700 to recoup their educational costs in about 8.7 years. It takes them, approximately 4 or 5 times the time that it does for the average student at University of Illinois, Chicago. So that's one way to look at ROIs that specific institutions offer institution-wide. Since then, we've actually had programmatic level data made available to us by the US Department of Education. And within this data, we can look at specific programs within an institution and see how much graduates are earning at that institution. And this is now measured at 4 years after graduation. That's the longest time frame that the US Department of Education has available to date, is 4 years after students have graduated. So rather than entering the institution, this answers a different question. It says, these are students that have done everything right. They've paid their tuition, they finished their classes, they've gotten their degree. Now, how much are they earning after they obtain a specific credential? And we can see that oftentimes major matters just as much, if not more, than the institution itself. As if you decided to major in sociology, which I did, it's obviously a huge mistake. Just kidding. But you can see that it's much more risky in terms of finances in comparison to some of your business or engineering related majors, which often go the top of the list. Therefore, if you calculate your ROI on these different kinds of majors, you're going to see different kinds of numbers. Students are going to have different kinds of numbers because while they may pay around the same price going in, they're going to have pretty substantial differences in terms of the earnings premium that they obtain after earning a credential. So I ran this price to earnings premium for all institutions, which I have available online. And I decided, it would be pretty neat to try to look at the question of what about lower income students? They pay a different amount than your average typical college student, and they earn a different amount, right? They start with more obstacles in their face. And ultimately, that does translate itself into the workplace. And we also can think of systemic discrimination and barriers that have been in place for these groups of students. So I decided to run these price to earnings premium numbers and figure out where are lower income students getting the best ROI. So now this was specific to students earning less than families who are earning less than $30,000 a year. So some of our most vulnerable students. So I ran all these numbers. I clicked enter on my Excel spreadsheet, and who popped up at the top of the list? It happened to be schools like Duke, Harvard, Yale, and University of Chicago. And I thought, great job, Michael. You just recreated the US News rankings. Congratulations, you can go home and have a cocktail. But then I started to look at these numbers just to the right of this. And I noticed that while these institutions may offer an extremely good ROI to lower income students, they hardly enroll any of them. There's hardly any of these students that go there in the first place. So it really brought me back to the question of, what's the point of higher ed in general? Is it really to recognize and reward the few and the fortunate who get into these institutions and that serves such a narrow version of who attends higher education today? Or is it to highlight institutions that are delivering on the promise of higher education, enrolling a broad group of students, lifting them up, and leaving them better off than the previous generation? And that's when I created my next project where I tried to answer that question. So instead of just looking at the ROI for low income students, I had these two different numbers. And if any of you are familiar with Raj Chetty's work at Harvard, I believe he has an organization called Opportunity Insights. He started this work about 10 or 15 years ago where they had student level data and they were taking a crack at trying to figure out, are these different quartiles or quintiles of students moving up after they attend a specific institution? Now, I decided that that work was really interesting, but I wanted to use federally available data. So I decided to look at these kinds of outputs and think about, okay, if an institution served these students really well, they should be recognized for serving those students really well. However, to actually create economic mobility, we need to take the types of students that they serve into account. Obviously, those students are facing different obstacles, and these institutions, there needs to be some sort of adjustment to recognize institutions that are not only serving the few and the fortunate and the most academically gifted really well, but the institutions that are actually lifting students up the socioeconomic ladder. So the way that I did this is schools like Duke and Harvard and University of Chicago, and I'm sorry to pick on that school for anyone who may have went there on this specific webinar, but I still rewarded them, right? I said, if you get into these schools and you're a lower income student, your ROI is still near the top. So I created a percentile rank and I still gave them, you know, a 99th percentile, 100th percentile. After all, if you're a lower income student and you do get in there, your ROI is going to be fantastic. You're usually given a very generous aid offer. Yes, you are academically gifted, but you're going to be earning a large earnings premium on average and be able to pay down those educational costs extremely quickly. But then I decided to take that percentile rank that was based off of the ROI for lower income students, and I decided to multiply that by the percentage of Pell Grant students at a school. So as you can see here, once you do that, you notice that some numbers get shifted around. Let's just say school A was Duke, which I think may have been my example here specifically. I think they have about 13.8% of Pell Grant students. Now, they serve those students extremely well, so they still earned 100th percentile in terms of ROI. But when you add those numbers together, you get a lower economic mobility index calculation at 0.138. So they actually dropped to number 4 out of this example of 5 institutions here. And we can see some other schools that serve more Pell Grant students, but also serve students pretty well jumping up. So what happens to these schools that I mentioned on the top of the list? I just decided to look at, you know, some of these schools that are on the top of the US News. And you can see here, you know, Harvard, who's ranked number 3 in US News rankings, they're tied for number 3. They actually dropped to number 847 when you take the percentage of Pell Grant students into account. Schools like University of Chicago, who are ranked number 8 in terms of the ROI that they provide low and moderate income students every year, they actually dropped to number 860 out of 1,328 institutions nationwide. Now, that begs the question of who raised to the top of this list. What I saw was it was actually in the top 10. It happened to be all Hispanic serving institutions, specifically located in New York, California, and Texas. They serve a broad group of students, like places at like CUNY and the Cal State system, which may be familiar to most of you. They serve a broad group of students. They serve them extremely well. They leave them better off economically, and they allow them to pay down their educational costs quickly. I also notice a lot of other kinds of institutions that are nowhere to be found on US News rankings, showing impressive outcomes when you take these 2 factors into account. Schools like historically Black colleges and university, which are hardly anywhere when you look at the US News rankings, they're actually 7 in the top of the economic mobility index. So that's something that I put together a while back, and I hope to continue to build on in the near future. So I do have all this information available on my website, which is HEA Group. Now, something that's unique about my organization, if I might give myself a pat on the back, is that one thing that we try to do to differentiate ourselves is to make all of the data publicly available. I don't think that this data has any value sitting on my desktop. I want others to use it. I want them to utilize it. I want them to create from it in their own ways. So rather than creating a research project and keeping all the data to myself, we make all of our data ready for download. The College Scorecard is very confusing, like many data sets that a lot of very smart people put together. They have all complicated variable names. I try to clean that up for everyone so that if you are a counselor, if you're a researcher, if you're a journalist, or if you're an institutional administrator, you can download this data and easily access it and easily use it. Here's some of my information. If you want to follow me for all things data online, you can definitely email me. I'm happy to reach out. But hopefully we can go to answering some questions. And I hope that that presentation was somewhat useful, but happy to continue the discussion now.
Thank you so much. Michael, I know there were a couple of questions that were in the chat, and I think Abby, you had a couple, if you want to come off of mute and just ask your questions, and then we can, I think we're small enough we can manage that. If you want to come off of mute one at a time and ask your question, but Abby, if you want to go first, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'm trying to find my question because now I'm getting, that's a lot of information and it's great. But, I guess, I think back to like, I don't have children of my own, but my nieces and nephews that are, one is graduating college right now. And he, for example, is at University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, which I know when I was going to college was one of those schools that you think, oh, if you can get in there, you can get a college, you get a college degree. I just wonder about, with these numbers of what the earnings are, I just heard something on the radio yesterday about that the class that's just coming out of college now is beginning to experience what many of our, many of us and those who followed us, where they're having a very hard time even just landing a job. And that's even coming from top schools like University of Michigan. And so I'm wondering if those numbers are taken in, because their earnings obviously are going to be either zero or, maybe they're getting some sort of aid, but their numbers are going to bring the cumulative numbers down.
Yeah.
And I think there's a number, and again, I don't want to be presumptuous. I don't have my own children, and I don't have my own children, period. So they're not in school. But I just wonder about those that are saying, well, I'm not going to take that job now because I think there's a better one out there, or, I shouldn't have to settle for $30,000 a year with a college degree. So I'm not going to work. I'm going to live at my parents' home and not work. Like and then I also am always concerned about these very high academic programs, not just for low income, but I just think for all kids now. And the additional, so I'm going to add in my other question about the additional costs. If someone's a graphic design major, they have to pay for printers, they have to pay for having access to a lot of online portals that you pay annually for. And when we're talking about low income families, that make, let's say, 30,000 or below, I don't think that they can afford to pay $100 a month for Adobe or some of these other, and it seems to me that those expenses are not being taken into consideration when we look at the total cost of college. It's no longer tuition and room and board. There's all of these fees and extra costs. So I'm just wondering how all of that. So now I'm going to shut up and let others ask their question.
Well, those are great questions, Ivy, and super relevant today. There was just a report that came out of an organization called Strada, Strada, and they actually found that there are a substantial number of students who are now being undermatched after they attend college, right? So and kind of the point of the report is that how important your first job is, right? If you start out at a lower paying profession, a lower paying position, your ability to make more over time is just substantially affected, right? Like if you make $40,000, the chance that you're going to get bumped up to 100 is lessened, where if you start off at 50 or 60, and these numbers of $10,000 extra a year obviously all add up substantially over time. So I do think that we don't really know the answer to your question yet of students who are entering the workforce, but we can see that there is an undermatching problem, which is disproportionately affecting students of color and students from historically disadvantaged groups. So that's something for us all to keep in mind. Now, the numbers that I look at is something called net price. And basically what it does is it takes the total cost of attendance into account, which should include books and fees and living expenses. I think that that's something really critical, especially for lower income students. Not only do people need to study, do they need Adobe, but they also need a place to live. Like that's just the reality. If you're not living somewhere, stable, you can't study and you can't expect to finish a degree in 4 years. But what it does is it takes all the scholarships, whether that be a Pell Grant scholarship from the federal government, a state scholarship, or an institutional scholarship into account. So it's the most accurate representation, I think, of what we have broadly in terms of college costs nowadays. Now, we can see that at University of Illinois, I think it was Chicago, like $14,000 a year is seen as, it's around average is what it is nationally, but that's not a drop in the bucket by any means. And to your point, I mentioned that the number one reason why students attend school nowadays is for greater employability. The number one reason why students don't attend college nowadays, their biggest deterrent is affordability. So I think that your points are super relevant, and these are both parts of the equation that we need to keep in mind. However, I would be, I think it would, something that I need to mention is that we still do need to have the message, especially for low and moderate income students, that college is worth it. Now, they just need to be discerning on how they pick, which college they pick, and oftentimes which major they pursue. We can see that the vast majority of colleges are still worth it. We know that there's a big earnings premium generally when it comes to obtaining some sort of post-secondary award. So it's just really important that we understand the value and continue to ask for higher value when it comes to institutions of higher education across the United States today.
Michael, thank you so much. I think you've shined a light on a really important set of issues. How do you think about the fact that for a lot of higher education institutions, the main purpose is not, at least not the only important purpose of college, is to secure a financially secure future for graduates. Higher education is supposed to conduct research. It's supposed to share the best of what we already know. It's supposed to hopefully shift people with, well, very understandable motives for their own individual well-being, to also think about the broader well-being of communities that are bigger than themselves, right? Higher ed has these multiple purposes.
Yeah.
How do we think about that along with what is so obviously important, that people attend college and can improve the material conditions of their lives?
Yeah. So those are really important points, and there are so many benefits to college beyond economics. Agreed, 100%. The verdict is out. There are many benefits that students obtain by setting foot inside a college campus. Now, that being said, I have to look at things, or I do look at things through a federal policy lens, right? And I'm thinking about this in terms of, we're funding these higher education endeavors for students across the United States. And we can see that there are some institutions that don't just fail students, but they actually leave them worse off. These are the majority of students that they're leaving financially worse off. We talked about some of the affordability numbers, and because it's so expensive, it's a huge investment that we can't discount. And if the majority of students are earning less than the typical high school graduate, they're actually in more of a rut than if they hadn't attended that institution in the first place. Now, I would say the vast majority of schools don't do this. They meet those minimal economic benchmarks. And that's why I'm kind of focused on these what I term the minimal economic benchmarks. If students aren't earning at least this amount, do we really expect them to be civically engaged? Are they really going to be happier? So I think that there are, you need one to accomplish the other. And I'm setting the bar so extremely low intentionally when it comes to these numbers. Now, I think once you get past these numbers, to your point, like, it becomes a little more squishy, right? Like $40,000 a year versus $50,000 a year on average. Like, does that mean a substantial difference in that institution? Like, maybe, maybe not. We also know that some schools focus on things that are super valuable to society, but they're not rewarded as if they're super valuable to society, like institutions that focus on teaching and social work. So these are all factors that need to be taken into consideration. But in terms of, what we find acceptable and what I think would be a more effective and efficient use of taxpayer dollars moving forward. That's the reason why I'm taking the lens I'm taking. So I hope that's helpful. Do you want to?
Hey, Michael. Oh, I had a quick question. Rachel Rosen from Noble Schools in Chicago. I just wondered if you had any, through the lens that you've been looking at, like through this report and your findings, if you have any predictions specifically about the high school graduate cohorts 2024 and then maybe even bleeding into 2025, how this whole FAFSA debacle, we will call it, slash failure is going to affect some of these findings moving forward for low income students.
I am terrified. So, I mean, the FAFSA isn't my primary area of expertise, but I've obviously become so much more knowledgeable of how this is affecting students over the past 4 or 5 months. We're seeing a substantial fewer amount of students that have actually filled out the FAFSA, period. My guess is that the majority of students who this is most affecting is low and moderate income students specifically. Now, these students won't, if they don't fill out the FAFSA, they're not going to know whether or not they would receive aid and whether or not they would even think about scholarship funds that they might get, because college is oftentimes more affordable than people think after filling out such a form. The other thing that I've seen that's happening, which is for more higher achieving students, I believe, is now they're starting to think about enrollment decisions, and they still haven't received their aid offer. Yet schools are requiring them to make an enrollment decision by May 1st. Yet they don't know how much it will cost. I've encouraged folks, meaning institutions, and I believe some states have even done this, to push back their enrollment deadlines. I think it's critical at this point in time that students have all of the information in front of them before they make one of the largest financial decisions of their life, so that they'll have that investment part of the return investment equation before they actually commit to a school. So I talked to a lot of high schoolers recently who have brought this up, and they're very worried and they don't know where to enroll. They're waiting on their financial aid award letter to figure out before they officially submit, and enroll in an institution. So I don't know. I mean, I know that a lot of people in my sphere are extremely worried about enrollment numbers over the next year, and I think that we'll just have to wait and see. Now, the one last thing I'll say on that is that it's critical that more people attend college at the same time. Like, this is not an okay thing that folks are just not going to enroll this year. There was a report that came out of Center for Education and Workforce at Georgetown University, and it suggested that 71% of students will require some sort of post-secondary credential. I believe it was by the year 2033, so within the next decade. Now, that doesn't mean a 4-year credential necessarily. That could mean a 2-year credential. That could mean a college certificate. But we will need some sort of post-secondary training so that they're equipped with the necessary skills to enter this 21st century workforce and maintain the competitiveness within America globally. So I think this has huge implications that we're going to see trickle down over the next year or two.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I know this is sort of a prep question. I had sent Michael the recent Wall Street Journal article that talked about technical education and young people choosing to go into welding or becoming electricians or whatever. And I'm wondering if you have any information or data or perspective on that as an alternative to 4-year, even 2-year college.
Absolutely. And I'll just, this kind of hits on Michael Barber's question as well before. We're not, the typical student of today, the traditional student is not the traditional student anymore. It's not the 18-year-old who goes into college and sits there for 4 years and eats Hare Krishna lunch on the quad and thinks of a lot of great ideas. And yes, I'm describing my college experience. But oftentimes we get students who are exploring shorter term credentials. We have a large group of students who are considering 2-year degrees at community colleges as a more affordable, effective option to enter the workforce quickly, or considering shorter term certificate programs. Now, when shorter term certificate programs like the one that you mentioned, Michael, work well, they're one of the fastest paths to socioeconomic mobility. You're typically in school for 6 to 18 months. You're only paying tuition and fees for 6 to 18 months. You gain a specific skill that equips you to enter the workforce and start earning immediately. When these work, they work extremely well. Now, that being said, they're oftentimes the riskiest credentials across the United States. About half of them show the majority of students earning less than the typical high school graduate, even a number of years after they enroll. So while they make this promise, we need to be discerning with this specific credential, possibly even more than others, as they're showing disproportionately bad outcomes for some types of institutions that offer them. Do we want to go through another question, or?
I've got another.
Go ahead.
What do you think an effective approach would be to call out the really bad actors in some needed ways?
Well, I think that that's sort of an approach that I've taken over the past 5 to 10 years, right? It's sort of at first, like when the U.S. Department of Education released this data, they kind of went through the 5 stages of grief, institutions across the United States. It was like denial, this isn't real. Where are you getting these numbers from? The numbers are flawed. Greed, bargaining, like, okay, if you're going to use this graduation rate number, why don't you use this graduation rate number instead and make us look a little bit better? And like, I think that we finally come to acceptance. Like, these numbers are real. And now sort of how do we use them? So I think that transparency is an initial starting point, right? Making these numbers widely available is one way to do it. And I tried to create demand. Like, lawmakers didn't know that these kinds of schools existed, that were federally funded schools. I actually went to a lawmaker who was in the Senate, and it was their policy person. And I said, look at all these schools with less than a 10% graduation rate, right? Like, and he said, well, these aren't accredited schools. And I said, yes, they are. They're accredited institutions that receive federal funding from the United States government. And the point being, like, they just didn't know that it even existed. So this work is sort of in the process of creating this demand, which hopefully then sparks institutional and state and federal policy change. So I think that it's really interesting for me to do this work federally, but there are some states that are starting to take on this work as well. And I think that's where a lot of the folks on this call might be able to step in to think about, what are the outcomes in Illinois? A lot of students, when they go to college, it's only within a few, 50 miles of their house. They're usually not going out of state. And that's usually the best deal that they'll get. The best ROI for the majority of students. But what is the actual ROI? Where are they serving students well? And how's the state funding these? Are we rewarding institutions that are, lifting this generation of students up? Or do we keep funding schools just based off of enrollment and not whether their students actually serving students well?
We have other questions for Michael?
I just, this is Courtney Cockrell here. This is just such sobering data. It's not new. I've heard about all of this information, but this latest Georgetown report that I haven't read through. And thank you, Edith, for sharing like this stat in here. And Michael, I'm just curious about your response to this stat that by 2031, this projection that 28% of all jobs will be for workers with high school diplomas. I mean, it's such a philosophical issue for me because, what you described as like your college experience, like sitting in the yard. Yeah. I mean, that is the experience at those highly selective schools, right? Still current state, right? Like I worked at Northwestern for over a decade, and that is the experience for students. It's a very lovely 4-year journey, right? But that's for such a privileged group.
Right.
Students who have the access or the resources, or to your point, those lower income students that are fully, where they're, the need is fully met. So I'm kind of rambling, but I'm curious about this projection, this 10-year, like 10 years ahead of like, you
Yeah.
know, yeah, just curious on your thoughts.
So my general thought on this is that states, counties, states, and the federal government hasn't done a sufficient job of matching credentials that they're awarding today with the projected job openings that would be available tomorrow. I think that there needs to be more of a specific intentional thought on what we're offering, the credentials, the skills that we're equipping students with, dare I say, especially in the era of artificial intelligence, and think about where these jobs are going to be opening and whether or not we're equipping students with the specific credentials. Now, higher ed, while it's so great, and I benefited in so many ways, it's not very good at thinking forward. It's more so looking backwards or looking at the present. And the way that we get money, is enrollment. It's the more students that are enrolled, the more tuition is paid. We get it subsidized, through the federal government, oftentimes through grants and loans. That's how institutions are, maintaining their revenue from year to year to year. And it's not really on outcomes at all. And I think that we need to be careful with this. We don't want to if you just rewarded just pure outcomes, we would have schools like Duke and Harvard and University of Chicago and Northwestern getting all the money. So there needs to be ways to think about how are we aligning the credentials that are offered today with the job projections that, are mentioned in the Georgetown report and others? And is there a way to sort of combine this data that's available through the National Center for Education Statistics in terms of degrees awarded with that of the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the projections of tomorrow to where we're doing this in a more efficient manner?
Awesome. Well, on that note, I could listen to this group ask you questions all day, but I know people have other things they need to get to as well. So I want to first thank you for coming and joining us, for taking Michael's call, everything like that. It is such a privilege and an honor for us to have spent some time with you today. So thank you so much. A little bit of a shout out. Our next conversation will be on the Illinois Commission on Equitable Public Funding. I will say Pranav is here today. It's so nice to have you, Pranav, as one of our speakers next week, and really hope to see many of you there. I will put the registration in the chat. I'll also stay on for a few minutes. If you're not on our listserv and you want to be, just let Dinaz or I know. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a great day.
Thanks for having me.